the Canberra was a very unique aircraft in this war. First, as I've already said, we were a level bomber to start with compared to all the rest that were dive bombers. Its advantages were that it had a good long-range endurance, and so if we arrived in a target area and there were dive bombers actually operating at the time, we could sit up high and just stay in the area watching what was going on, and then finally come around once the other fighter bombers had done their work. Another advantage of the Canberra, we could get under the cloud. The dive bombers were not able to go and dive through cloud because it was too dangerous. So what we would do is we would just gently lower ourselves through a cloud layer of maybe 3,000, 4,000 or 5,000 feet, and we could then approach the target underneath the cloud and be able to actually prosecute our target bombing much better than the fighters, because they had to stay up high and couldn't come through that cloud. So that asset that the Canberra had of being able to go below the cloud was very useful. We had to be careful, of course, that we didn't go too low. Basically, our 1,000-pound bombs would put some shrapnel up to about 2,000 to 3,000 feet. And so as the bombing leader, I used to instill a requirement that we would allow our aircraft to go down to about 1,200 feet to release the bombs. That lows because we wanted to see the target, and that was the best way of seeing the target. Then we'd pull the aircraft up to about 2,000 feet as fast as we could. In the meantime, the bombs are dropping. So by the time the bombs went off, we were at 2,000 feet and reasonably safe. At one situation, I did arrive back at the base at Phan Rang, and as we stopped the engines, engineering officer came across to us and said, "Would you like to come and have a look at this?" And I stepped outside, and there on the integral fuel tank in the wing was a hole, and he put his hand in and pulled out a piece of our bomb. And I was the one who had told the troops that we were to keep above the bomb fragments, and yet I ended up wearing one myself. The Americans had a system of awarding Top Gun awards each month in order to encourage their pilots to drop as best they could their bombs. Their way of measuring the top gun for the month was based on how much bomb damage was caused in their particular missions. And so I used to joke with them and say, well, if you dropped all your bombs on top of Saigon, you would be the top gun for the month. Is that right? And we, however, did it differently. We did it by accuracy. And as the bombing leader, my job was to assess the bombing accuracy. And the way we did this is that we actually installed cameras in the aircraft, not in the bomb bay, just behind the bomb bay. There was from memory, there were old World War II vintage F-24 and F-52 cameras that took various pictures as we came into the bombing run. So we had an overlapping set of pictures. And what would happen is that after a bombing mission, the crews would come back and we had a bombing book, and they had to enter quite a lot of detail about their missions. And in that, they would be entering the description of the target, its location, and then they would be told to write down their estimate of the accuracy of the bombs. First of all, they had to describe the target, and then they had to say, well, we think that the bombs were on target or slightly off target, and they would describe that. And what would happen is that after the mission, the cameras would be unloaded and the photos would be taken back, and the camera would be taken back and the photos would be produced by the photographic section. And I, as the bombing leader, would then next day get these pictures and I would assess them. And I would actually look at the bombing pictures and compare it with the book statements by the crew as to what they claimed they'd done. I would then assess where the target was. I would measure where the bombs landed relative to the target, and we would judge our accuracy and for each crew. And I did this in a competitive way. Admittedly, I wasn't the first one to do this. I was the third or fourth bombing leader. I arrived in '69, whereas we'd been there since '67. But what happened was that I would then assess the accuracy, and we would have a very fierce competition, because our top gun of the month would be the one who had dropped the most accurate bombs. And so occasionally, or more than occasionally, I would have aircrew coming to me and having a go at me for perhaps being wrong in assessing where their bombs landed, because they wanted to be the top gun of the month. And one incident I did have myself was that one particular mission, I took off with the CO, Wing Commander Jack Boast, in our aircraft, and we couldn't get our wheels up. And what happened was that I persuaded him that, seeing we had all our bombs on board, let's not land with full bombs on, let's try and get them to be dropped. And so we called up the local Fan Rang people and who sent a forward air controller out, who said, yes, I've got a target for you and you can drop on this target. So not far from Fan Rang. We used to have quite a lot of Viet Cong fire mortars and rockets into our base. So there were some known locations where they used to be. And so we then, with our wheels down still, came round in our bombing pattern, and I managed to determine what sort of bombing angle we needed, because we were at very slow speed compared to our normal bombing speed. And we tried an initial first bomb just to see how we would go, and lo and behold, it landed on the target. And so we were then able to come round for the next 7 times to drop our bombs, and we got a couple of direct hits and a few near misses. And in the meantime, I'd taken photographs of this, and so I said to the CEO, I have a feeling that if we get these photos examined, we'll be the top guns for the month. And so we ended up landing and produced the photographic staff then took the cameras out and took them back to the lab for processing. At the same time, we were walking back to our departure point. Some incoming rockets came in from the Viet Cong, and so we then scrambled into the shelter. And at the time, the photographic staff who were preparing our photos also headed for the bunkers for safety. And when they got back to the photographic lab, the photos were actually in the emulsion, and nothing ever happened, and so they were lost. And so as a result of that, the CEO and I were never able to claim that we were top guns for the month. As far as losses are concerned, we lost 2 Canberras in Vietnam. After I came back, we had an aircraft flying a high altitude nighttime bombing mission by a friend of mine, Flying Officer Mike Herbert. In fact, Mike was a cadet at Point Cook when I was a flight commander, and he came in as a cadet, and I ended up being his cricket coach and also his flight commander. And then he came across to Vietnam when I was already in Phan Rang, and I flew a number of missions with him. He was a good young pilot, and he had good potential to be a future leader, having come through RAAF Academy. However, one night he didn't come back, and he was flying a high altitude combat sky spot mission, which basically consisted of us usually flying about 25 to 30,000 feet altitude under radar control from a ground controller who would direct us to a particular point in the sky and would tell us then to drop our bombs. And that's all we did. So we took off, flew up high level, dropped our bombs and came back and landed, and that was our mission. Mike didn't come back from that mission that night, and so his remains with he and his navigator were found much later on and brought back to Australia. We're not sure how he ended up getting killed. The other one was with the CAO Wing Commander John Downing, and he was also doing a combat sky spot mission, but he was actually shot by a surface-to-air missile, and those two ejected safely and were picked up on the ground and flown back to Fan Rang. So they were very lucky and in being saved. So that they were the two we lost. The book Dreadful Lady Over the Mekong Delta that I wrote was aimed at filling a gap. Earlier on, my friend Doug Hurst had written a book on magpies in Vietnam, and that was a good summary of the overall activities that 2 Squadron got involved with. And in addition, he put a fair bit of detail on the loss of Mike Herbert and Bob Carver and what happened to them. I felt that there hadn't been any specific book or information put out there from people who actually served in Vietnam. And I looked in my logbook, and it seemed to me that I'd covered quite a high percentage of my missions were actually flown over the southern part of Vietnam in which we called 4 Corps, which was over the Mekong Delta. And there were particular peculiarities about flying in that region. The rest of South Vietnam was hilly and so on, and we would conduct close air support missions in daytime over the hills. But in 4 Corps, it was a very wet with canals everywhere. And it was interesting in the sense that, for instance, our green satin radar, which we used to provide ground speed and drift, would quite often be inoperative because of reflections over the water, particularly as we were turning, and the radar beam from the Doppler radar would not return very well to the aircraft. So we had troubles in that regard. So we used to have to do a lot of manual calculations and estimates of how to bomb our target. So my book covered those particular areas which hadn't been really covered before by anyone else. And so, as I say, I was filling a gap, and I did it for a number of reasons. One was to, I suppose, provide the history to my family of what I actually did in Vietnam. And so there was a personal aspect to it, covering my own operations, etc. But I also wanted to give the whole context. And so I introduced I covered the introduction to the war and why we were there and so on in the first part of the book, and then concentrated on our active bombing activities in the second part of the book.
And I have to say that the overview of the whole campaign, the operational strategies, the structure is all very, very well laid out. And I discovered a whole lot of things that I didn't know before about how things operated there. Awfully complex, but you do a brilliant job of laying all of that out.
Thank you.
Yeah, brilliant.
The book is basically aimed toward the younger generation in the sense of saying, well, here's a history of a bombing operation or a series of bombing operations, and hopefully there may be some lessons that can be learnt from our experience. And so I wanted to record that experience as graphically and as accurately as possible, so that future generations of aircrew who flew in bombing missions, tactical bombing missions, etc., would maybe get some lessons from what I learned.
Fantastic. Well, Bob, thank you so much for not only for writing the book and leaving this as a legacy, but also for the interview today. Thank you so much.
Pleasure, Matt. Thank you.